House of the Dragon has completely and utterly saved Game of Thrones. I have expressed my love and disdain of the Game of Thrones franchise in one of my recent videos, which I dropped when House of the Dragon began airing, so my thoughts on the Game of Thrones franchise are well documented, and needless to say, I thought Game of Thrones was a straight up masterpiece until it wasn't. Enter House of the Dragon, the story centering around George R.R. Martin's Fire and Blood, focusing on House Targaryen specifically, and the story of what happens after Viserys takes the throne from King Jaehaerys and all the drama and chaos that ensues from that point onward, aka the Dance of Dragons. And it was better than it had almost any right to be. House of the Dragon not only delivered a stellar season of television, better than anything I've seen on TV in a long time, but it managed to recapture the magic that made Game of Thrones what it was in the first place. It managed to combat the Balerion the Dread-sized shit that Benioff and Weiss took on the franchise with Season 8 of Game of Thrones. So this is why and how House of the Dragon managed to do the impossible, how it managed to save a franchise that was absolutely on its knees. This is how House of the Dragon saved Game of Thrones.
He can keep his tongue.
I never would have thought that Game of Thrones would once again be at the forefront of pop culture. House of the Dragon not only had to compete with the return of the Lord of the Rings franchise, not that it really put up much of a fight, but it also had to compete with the baggage of its own franchise, which was burned into oblivion in 2019 with Season 8 of Game of Thrones. Fun fact, I'm actually rewatching Game of Thrones again at the moment, and I just finished watching The Long Night, and no, I'm not okay. I may murder someone. Anyway, House of the Dragon had its work cut out for it. Luckily for this visit back to Westeros, these two super talented individuals were not involved. But George R.R. Martin was once again going to be involved much more with House of the Dragon than he was with the later seasons of Game of Thrones. I guess the dude was just looking for another excuse not to finish The Winds of Winter. Regardless, D&D out of the picture, George more involved in the show. It's no wonder that House of the Dragon ended up being something special. Throw in the return of Miguel Sapochnik, who directed certified banger episodes of Game of Thrones, such as Hardhome, Battle of the Bastards, and The Winds of Winter. He did also direct The Long Night and The Bells, which were arguably the two most disappointing episodes of Game of Thrones ever, but they were well directed. The fault with those episodes was always on the page, not behind the camera. So House of the Dragon was always in safe hands from a directorial standpoint, and wouldn't you know it, he got the show off to an excellent start with The Heirs of the Dragon. The show's first episode, which was the most important episode, not necessarily plot-wise, but more so what it represents. And that was the return to Westeros. The first episode of this show was a blatant return to form for the Game of Thrones franchise. Perhaps the most well-rounded episode in Westeros since possibly the tail end of Season 6 of Game of Thrones. It was grounded, it caught us up quickly on the time period, it had the plotting, the politics, the Game of Thrones was once again at the forefront of the show. As entertaining as seasons 5, 6, and 7 of Game of Thrones could be at times, it was less about the politics and more so about the explosions, the spectacle. It had its moments of being incredible, sure, but seasons 1 to 4 of Game of Thrones was just the pinnacle, because it was never afraid to take it slow to let the characters and their motivations be the sole driver of the plot. House of the Dragon established straight away that it was going to be more like the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones and less like the later seasons, a true return to form for the Game of Thrones franchise. This is one of the biggest factors as to why this show works, why it was able to shake the rotten stigma of the Game of Thrones name after what happened with Season 8. It was able to prove to the audience that Game of Thrones in 2022 can still work. It can still capture that magic and essence that made people fall in love with the franchise over 10 years ago. Now, the characters of House of the Dragon are some of the best in the Game of Thrones series already. I don't think anybody has quite topped Tyrion Lannister as my favorite just yet, but I'd be lying if I said that there weren't multiple in the race to do so. Not just 1 or 2, I mean about 5. That's a testament to House of the Dragon's writers, as well as the actors, because seriously, if Paddy Considine doesn't get an Emmy nod for playing King Viserys, I'm gonna lose it. He was incredible in this show, like mind-blowingly good. I mean, we all saw how good he was, except for this guy.
And the king, I mean, look, who am I to knock anybody's acting, but like, I don't find the king to be very good.
Yeah. You dumb bitch.
One of the show's greatest strengths is how it uses deeply flawed characters. It uses them in such a way where you see their depravities firsthand and you just feel like you can't sympathize with this character. But on the other hand, you see the good side to them, their key motivations, the love for their family, the belief of what they're doing is right. And it confuses you as the viewer on what you want to feel, whose side you want to take, the black or the greens. And this is something that this show excels in to a masterful degree. And I think that's why Daemon in the finale may have sent some people the wrong way. Personally, I thought his actions in the finale were completely within character. This is the same dude that declared his dead nephew as heir of the day, for God's sake. Like, Daemon is one of my favorite characters in this show for several reasons. Is he an arsehole? Yes. But he's also a very deeply complex character. His love of Rhaenyra and his almost unspoken love of his family, and specifically his brother, just give you enough to not entirely label Daemon as a villainous character.
I will speak of my brother as I wish. You will not.
I definitely got Jaime Lannister vibes, like, you know the dude's an arsehole, but deep down you know he's also not. Some of my favorite scenes of the show actually involve Daemon showing genuine care and sorrow for both Rhaenyra and Viserys. You understand in these moments that he's not truly the worst of the worst. The first scene at Emma's funeral where he's supporting Rhaenyra, and in Lord of the Tides where he helps Viserys sit on the Iron Throne and even places the crown onto his brother's head. His dialogue remains minimal, but his actions say everything. The old show, don't tell. Without a doubt, maybe my favorite scene of the entire show. So it makes sense that he'd be furious like he was in the finale. He blames the Greens for his brother's death because Rhaenys couldn't confirm how it happened. And of course that they put Aegon on the throne straight away. So when Rhaenyra doesn't want to go full scale into war immediately, Daemon loses it for a moment. It was a reminder that Daemon is still not exactly the best person. He's still quite unhinged, unpredictable, and at times callous, just like he was earlier in the show. And this is just Daemon. We see these layers upon layers across various characters within the show. Rhaenyra, Alicent, Viserys, Otto, Jesus, even the secret to the Fountain of Youth himself, Sir Criston Cole. The show does an incredible job in showing you each side to the characters. It makes you constantly question who you're actually rooting for in this story. Each of the main characters had such a big arc in this show, even if there wasn't necessarily a ton of screen time for them. Corlys is a great example of this. He doesn't get a ton of screen time, but his motivations, his goals, they're crystal clear. Not to mention he drops one of the best lines of the show.
History does not remember blood. It remembers names.
It's a major strength of House of the Dragon that you still understand where all of these characters are coming from. It's clear as day. Alicent and Rhaenyra, you see their relationship fall apart, you see it turn violent. The only thing keeping a lid on anything seems to be Viserys. But once he dies, the gloves are off, and anything can happen, which the last 2 episodes of the series show very clearly. And all of this excellent character work was translated to the child characters in the second half of the season. I will say though, on a side note, it was at times a little hard to keep track of all the names of the children because 1, there's so many of them, 2, their names are all pretty much identical, and the casting choices across the time jumps kind of made it a little jarring on exactly which kid was which. Like, younger Aegon looks like older Aemond, and older Aegon looks like younger Aemond. Like, if it wasn't for the eye patch, this shit would have been really damn confusing. But the show does a decent job in connecting a subtle or not so subtle dot so you can figure out who the character is most of the time. But I digress. The child characters in this show are quickly becoming some of my favorite as they encapsulate how this show handles its characters so well. I see people get really worked up over the time jumps of this show and that they can be a little bit unnecessary. Whilst I understand that at times they can be a little jarring, I think the time jumps are ideal for this story, not only because they're important to the source material, but without the time jumps in the second half of the season, there is no shot I would care about characters like Aegon, Luke, Jace, even Aemond. Seriously, this dude is like Crispin Glover on crack and I love it. But the time jumps work because they give us this little nugget of character development that pays off heavily after the time skip. For example, we see Aemond be the butt end of the joke. We see him claiming Vhagar as his dragon, and then we see the fallout with Jace and Luke where he loses his eye and the rift it causes within the family. This is very, very important. We need to have seen this, so when we see Aemond, we know what we need to know about this character. It's better than one initial time jump where we just see this Crispin Glover looking dude with an eye patch and wonder what the hell his deal is. We know his deal. We know how much damage this dude can end up doing. And because we've seen firsthand what happened to lead him to this point, we care 10 times more about him as the viewer. They don't have to explain it with dialogue to let us fill in the gaps of the vital backstory and just hope that we care. The time jumps complement the hell out of this story, and because of that, it allows the characters to progress naturally. This show manages to blast its way through the story, but also manages to take its time in doing so the characters can evolve. The balance that they manage to strike with the writing is just such a far cry from the later seasons of Game of Thrones. The method of this form of storytelling is unique, and you know, it might not be for everybody, but for the kind of show that they've written, it works flawlessly. It services the characters, and this first season was a perfect season in setting up the Dance of Dragons. Now, speaking of dragons, I was extremely worried with this show, of course, being called House of the Dragon and having like over a dozen dragons appear in it. I was worried that it was just going to be all about the dragons. No substance to the storytelling, just dragons setting everything on fire because fire equals good. But there are episodes in this series where there are no dragons. Now, don't get me wrong, dragons are great, but as Game of Thrones later seasons suggest, just because the dragons have more screen time, it doesn't mean it makes the show better.
And there's not enough dragon. I want to see dragons. I want to see them fighting. I want to see them torching shit up.
Now, if I was to critique something in this show, there is the scene where Rhaenys busts through the floor to ruin Aegon's ceremony. Cool scene, sure. Does it make sense? Yes and no. I've seen the excuse the writers gave for this scene even happening.
She knows if she sets fire to that dais, she ends any possibility of war and probably sets peace throughout the realm. But I think probably doesn't want to be responsible for doing that to another mother.
And then there's also what Rhaenys said in the finale, that the war wasn't hers to begin.
A war is like to be fought over this treachery, to be sure, but that war is not mine to begin.
So by that notion, I guess the scene is fine, but I can't say I was originally totally on board with it. And another moment the show had that didn't hit home for me was the very obvious day for night shots in episode 7. It's super nitpicky of me, and there's probably a good reason as to why they ended up doing this. But this is a great scene, and it's kind of completely ruined by just how dark that it is. But anyway, back on a positive note. Without doubt, a major contributor in helping this franchise find its return to form with House of the Dragon can be explained in just 2 words. Ramin Djawadi. What John Williams is to Star Wars, this dude is to Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones may have dipped in quality throughout its series run, but there is one thing that never did, and that was the music. In fact, I'd argue it actually got even better as the show progressed. So bringing back Ramin Djawadi was one of the key elements in this show's success. The iconic Game of Thrones intro was reused for this series. I've seen some people complain about that. Honestly though, I don't see why. It's the Game of Thrones intro, it's synonymous with the franchise. And nothing makes you feel like you're back in Westeros like the Game of Thrones theme blaring through your speakers at the start of every episode. This familiarity with the music without a doubt helped viewers feel like they were back in Westeros, and it helped this show establish itself early. Like, the importance of a good score in a show, it can't be overstated. It really can't. I think back to when Obi-Wan Kenobi came out earlier this year, the music in that show was completely arse. And I felt a real disconnect from the show because of it. But I never got that with House of the Dragon. It felt like Game of Thrones instantly. And that was just one of the many contributing factors as to how this show proved to be a return to form for this franchise.
This is brilliant, but I like this.
Okay, I might not be quite at that point yet, but you've got to admit, House of the Dragon gave Season 1 of Game of Thrones a run for its money. Do I think it's better than Season 1 of Game of Thrones? Not quite, but it's pretty damn close, to be honest. Look, it's impossible to talk about House of the Dragon without drawing comparisons to Game of Thrones. I mean, when you're a prequel show, it's kind of hard to avoid comparisons to the original. Thankfully though, House of the Dragon is a more than worthy addition to the franchise. But there are many things that each show does better than the other. I'm just not ready to say that House of the Dragon is better than Game of Thrones because we're only 1 season in. And it's going to have to take something pretty special to top the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones. But I think this show more than has the potential to try its best. After all, we should be getting around 4 seasons of House of the Dragon, at least that's if George gets what he wants. So it doesn't look like the show is really going to overstay its welcome. But let's straight up compare the 2 shows. House of the Dragon is clearly seeking a similar style of writing to the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones, like I mentioned earlier. The political aspect of Game of Thrones was always the best thing about it. Now, due to there being no threat from beyond the wall in House of the Dragon, the show almost has to put more of an emphasis on the game being played. The politics, the scheming, the shady characters getting their moments to shine, the elite dialogue between deeply complex characters, the monologues that just stick in your head. It's obvious that this show plans to also have the massive action set pieces as you'd expect in the Dance of Dragons. But House of the Dragon is crushing it because it's keeping the roots of the franchise. George being so close to the project, I think, is really helping with this. When George started to be less involved in the later seasons of Game of Thrones, you notice that the show just became more of a fantasy action show as opposed to the political fantasy that it used to be. Now, I'm of course not saying that the early seasons of Game of Thrones had no action. I mean, look at Blackwater and Watchers on the Wall. But it's clear how much focus the writers of House of the Dragon want to put on characters pulling the strings to set this war up. Essentially, season 1 of House of the Dragon is a setup season, yet it was gripping and it never, not even once, got boring. And it also feels like we have Game of Thrones inspired characters littered throughout the entire show. Characters like Lara Strong, the dude is straight up Littlefinger, just a bit more weird and perverted. Mysaria has shades of Varys, and the characters that love to play the Game of Thrones like Otto Hightower. Even Sir Harold gets a moment nearly identical to Sir Barristan. I love the parallels between the two shows. Subtle nods.
I don't want to.
But it never goes too far in trying to mimic what came before. The writing team for House of the Dragon really let this show stand on its own 2 feet whilst paying homage to the original Game of Thrones series. Now, Game of Thrones always had politics at the forefront, with this brooding sense of dread overshadowing almost anything that happens. That dread, of course, being what lies beyond the wall with the White Walkers. House of the Dragon's looming dread isn't this distant threat, because the threat is within the walls already. It's this civil war brewing between these characters. So in that sense, it feels like House of the Dragon can afford to spend more time with these characters to flesh them out and to plant seeds of what is going to be one of the craziest wars we've seen on screen in this franchise. House of the Dragon feels like more of an intimate drama where you can really get close to these characters, whereas Game of Thrones sprawls all over the place. Because of that, I feel like the relationships and all the betrayals that we see in this show have a better payoff due to it being more of an intimate drama. That's the advantage of focusing in on one house in Westeros as opposed to juggling the Lannisters, the Starks, the Boltons, the Baratheons, Daenerys and Essos, and even the Wall. Now, even though the Wall was an interesting part of Game of Thrones, the fact that it was juggling the Night's Watch, the Wildlings, as well as the White Walkers, it could often detract from the political aspect of the show. Because Game of Thrones' home base, so to speak, was always King's Landing. That's where the core of the story was always happening. But we'd spend so much time just all over the place. You don't get that in House of the Dragon. You get to stay in King's Landing for an entire episode. You get to stay in Driftmark for essentially an entire episode. You do go off to the Stepstones or Harrenhal occasionally, but it's mostly focused on an episode by episode basis in one location. Because of that, it just feels like a more personal show. That's why I think the payoff further down the line is going to be incredibly satisfying. Now, this praise of House of the Dragon is by no means taking a turn on Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones was perfect for what it was, a sprawling opera of sorts. Before Dumb and Dumber, ruined everything. But a lot of people when Game of Thrones first came out, whether they were right or not is irrelevant, but they would always say stuff like the show is too overwhelming, there's too many characters to follow. But House of the Dragon has no such issue. It's much more focused in that sense, and I think it's working to the show's benefit. In Game of Thrones, it's undeniable that you get to see more of Westeros, but that's where House of the Dragon uses what came before to its benefit. If you look at House of the Dragon in isolation, the world probably doesn't feel that big at all. They're banking on viewers having seen Game of Thrones already and painting a picture in their mind's eye when the Wall is mentioned, or the North. We never see it on screen, but most of the places we visit in Game of Thrones are mentioned at some point. So this is where I believe they have absolutely made the smartest decision with this show in allowing it to appeal to the masses. If you've seen Game of Thrones, then you don't need to see Winterfell to know what the characters in the show are talking about. You don't need to see the Wall, the Vale, you already know. But on the other hand, if you're a brand new viewer, this show is easily accessible because it's incredibly focused on just a few locations. This is a much more accessible show than Game of Thrones ever was, so it's no wonder it's doing insanely well. I have friends personally who are watching House of the Dragon before Game of Thrones and they're loving it. So in reality, House of the Dragon is absolutely genius. And it's going to bring in even more people to the Game of Thrones franchise as it's just more accessible. Now we've got to talk about the battles and the dragons if we're going to compare these two shows. Both shows handle their battle sequences very well. There is a little plot armor here and there in House of the Dragon, but nothing Jon Snow levels in Battle of the Bastards, or literally every main character in The Long Night. To Game of Thrones' later seasons' credit, even Season 8, the battle sequences were very well done, even when Dany destroyed King's Landing. Take the writing out of the equation and it was incredibly well done. House of the Dragon essentially continues this trend and nails its battle sequences, obviously with better writing. There are times when the CGI does go a little bit wonky, especially considering how good Drogon and Rhaegal's CGI was in Season 8. As much shit as we give Season 8 of Game of Thrones, Drogon and Rhaegal looked incredible. Some of the moments in House of the Dragon, the CGI wasn't quite up to par with its predecessor. But this is something that will more than likely improve in future seasons when the budget gets a little bit bigger. For now it works, and most of the time it's great anyway. The battle sequences in House of the Dragon are super entertaining, they're very well shot, they're well acted, the visuals are off the charts. The dragon sequences are again super entertaining and really just a teaser for what's to come. The final battle between Luke and Aemond with Arrax and Vhagar was great. I like the fact that it's neither Luke or Aemond that was responsible for Luke's death. It was literally dragon versus dragon, with neither rider having any control. It harkens back to Viserys' line earlier in the show about controlling the dragons being an illusion, and it also adds some sense to the madness of Aemond, that he's not just this evil caricature, and that he was actually trying to stop Vhagar from killing Arrax and Luke. It just added a bit of humanity to a character that I could really just see them going with just being one note and evil. I liked Aemond before this scene, but I liked him even more after it. I've heard some book readers take issue with how Aemond was handled here. That's fair enough, each to their own. But for me, this made Aemond even more compelling. Now, much like Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon does stray from its source material, which is for the most part working to the show's credit. Fire and Blood, which House of the Dragon is based on, was written from the perspective of an Archmaester, so not everything in the show necessarily needs to line up with the book to remain faithful. The Rhaenys scene in episode 9, for example, to my knowledge, was not in the book. This just gives the show freedom to keep and cut what they think works for the show, and the fact that George is overseeing all of this basically means that everything would need his blessing in a way. So this fills me with a lot of faith that this show is going to go in the right direction, unlike with Dumb and Dumber. Now, we do know from Game of Thrones itself, certain things are believed to have happened in this war. Now, I won't spoil them for you, but if you do rewatch Game of Thrones, be a little wary that there could be some potential House of the Dragon spoilers in the show, specifically in scenes involving Joffrey and a couple with Shireen. So if House of the Dragon makes you want to rewatch Game of Thrones like it did for me, just be prepared for that. Now, one thing fans can also take solace in is the fact that House of the Dragon's book adaptation is complete, so there won't be a situation where they run out of book material and the writers get exposed like with Game of Thrones. So in that way, House of the Dragon has a complete and clear direction. So both shows have excellent characters that operate in the grey. Both shows have incredible battle sequences, incredible dialogue, a strong focus on politics. Although I think the new seasons of House of the Dragon might stray from the politics a little more now that the Dance of Dragons has begun, I'd say that's about where the similarities end. House of the Dragon is much easier to follow, a more personal, intimate drama, and certainly stands on its own 2 feet as an incredible Game of Thrones show.
Now, which one of you cowards shit in my pants?
Now, we can't get through this video without talking in depth on the aftermath of Season 8 of Game of Thrones. I touched on it a little bit at the beginning of the video, but we're gonna get right into it here, as we can't discuss the savior of Game of Thrones without talking about the Season 8 aftermath, as well as the future shows coming down the line, because there's a few of them. The aftermath of Season 8 of Game of Thrones was absolutely huge, no one would deny that. It virtually put the franchise in the bin. I mean, how can you go from one of, if not the best TV show ever made, to whatever this was? A complete betrayal of everything that came before. Character arcs being thrown away, plot lines abandoned. The prince that was promised? What prince? Unearned moments that make no sense due to the amount of time they gave themselves to finish this series. Wrapping up 8 seasons of build-up in 1 episode with more questions than answers. And fucking Euron Greyjoy. My point is, Season 8 was a disaster, and there are 2 people to blame for it. So House of the Dragon realistically should never have worked like it did. But the fact that it did work has restored my faith that Hollywood might actually learn something from this That even if an IP has been dragged through the mud, there is one thing that can get things back on track, and it's not money. It's actually having a good story being told with time, thought, and care put into it. Imagine if Disney tried as hard with The Rise of Skywalker as HBO did with House of the Dragon.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Look, the frustration of Season 8 of Game of Thrones is a constant. It's probably never really going to go away. Especially when your show was once the pinnacle of TV. To stoop that low, it's almost unforgivable and almost a betrayal of all the time invested of the viewers. And to think it was also the writers could go work on a Star Wars project that never even happened, it just makes it even more frustrating. The writers of Game of Thrones seemingly never recovered from their butchery of the Game of Thrones franchise, but it seems like the franchise itself has absolutely recovered because of House of the Dragon. I don't think it can be understated just how incredible that is. That House of the Dragon has managed to save a franchise that got absolutely butchered with just one season of television. Never have I myself as a fan of this series been more excited to see where it's going to go next. The idea of a Jon Snow spin-off a couple of years ago honestly made me sick. Like, what is the point? But now I'm all of a sudden really excited to see a Jon Snow series continuing on after the events of Season 8. Why is that? Because of House of the Dragon. I actually have faith that this franchise can still work. That the writing teams can actually treat these characters and stories with care. And that these two boneheads won't be anywhere near the new series. I mean, they can actually fix but sort of continue where Season 8 left off. I'm not asking for a retcon or anything, and this may be a tangent, so I apologize. But the Jon Snow series could absolutely fix things. Like the Prince that was promised prophecy, maybe that can actually come to a head eventually instead of throwing it away like Dumb and Dumber did. Also, Drogon is still flying around and Jon's the last living Targaryen. As for Daenerys, who even knows at this point? Maybe she can come back from the dead. Maybe Drogon performed CPR. I don't know. I'm spitballing here. I just want to get a better ending to Game of Thrones series than what Season 8 dished up. At the worst, it could just be Jon and Ghost doing their thing beyond the wall whilst Tormund continues his quest for the big woman.
The big woman's still here?
But tangents aside, my point is, House of the Dragon has completely thrown away any negativity that I have toward the prospects of future Game of Thrones series. It has single-handedly shifted the tone of not just my own outlook of the franchise, but clearly millions of fans as well. The hangover from Season 8 of Game of Thrones was a pretty rough one and it lasted for a few years, but it feels like it's truly gone now. It feels like this franchise has had new life injected into it, and I'm completely on board with what comes next. So to summarize this video, to say that House of the Dragon has swooped in to save the franchise, I think would be an understatement. We all saw how bad things got with the ending of Game of Thrones, and we're now seeing how good this franchise can be once again. In the hands of competent writers, with George being more involved, House of the Dragon for me is a damn near perfect show. There are only tiny gripes I have with it, nothing major whatsoever. The characters are all compelling, they have great arcs, absolute top shelf acting, it tells a compelling story packed with suspense, and the usual brutality and unapologetic Game of Thrones quirks that let this series stand out from the rest, and it doesn't put the dragons above story and character. House of the Dragon completely succeeds in telling a new story in the same world that feels fresh yet still deeply connected to the roots of the franchise that made it so successful over a decade ago. All of these elements combine and prove that House of the Dragon absolutely saved the Game of Thrones franchise.